So good evening, and I'd like to call the Council-in-Committee meeting to order. And today we have one delegation, and that would be Jay Chalk, BC Ombudsperson. And I'd like to welcome you, and you can come up and you can provide us with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Hepner, and thank you, Mayor and councillors, for having me for a few minutes to talk about fairness in local government and the role of both of our office and your city in ensuring that fairness. It's the first time I'm back in this building since in a previous movie, I was responsible for some justice system collaboration projects and worked with the senior staff here in the city on the criminal justice hub project that's underway now down at the Justice Precinct, and they were very helpful in that. But I think that spirit of collaboration speaks well, really, for what I'm talking about tonight, which is really about ensuring that the residents of every municipality are dealt with fairly. Indeed, all people who have to deal with public authorities in the province. I had the opportunity earlier today to sit down with the city manager for a bit, and I noted certainly I'm new in the office, but so I said to my staff, so tell me about dealing with Surrey, and one thing they said was that they very much appreciated the culture and attitude of the staff in the city to take a fresh look at things when we get a complaint, and certainly to that they were quite willing to have complainants talk to the city staffer who actually is somebody who can make a difference, rather than centralizing those sorts of complaints, but really adopting a more decentralized approach, which I think is most helpful. A little bit about us. The first ombudsman, and it used to be called ombudsman, now they're called ombudspersons, in the world was established in Sweden in 1809, and that bottom left picture is a banner from the new Canadian Museum of Human Rights, which has a giant room with the sort of broad sweep of world history and showing things both good and bad related to human rights. And one notable thing is I was there in October, and I saw that up on the wall, so I snapped a photo of it, and it's kind of neat to see that reflected in that institution. But ombuds functions didn't come to British Columbia until 1979 and didn't apply to local government right away. Originally, the ombudsman was really responsible only for the provincial government per se, but then in 1995, our jurisdiction was expanded to include municipalities, regional districts, the Islands Trust, local governments generally. We're responsible for ensuring administrative fairness in 2,800 public bodies in British Columbia, so quite a broad sweep, but basically the provincial government, all the crown corporations, all the local governments, regional districts, etc., schools, school districts, universities, colleges, regulatory bodies of professions, law society, etc. So quite a broad sweep in terms of jurisdiction. But with local governments, we have, as I said, a 20-year history in terms of ensuring fairness. And it's interesting to note that the Ombudsman in Ontario, they just got jurisdiction over municipalities a month ago, January 1st. So they've actually been talking to us about, basically learning about how it works when one is receiving complaints about local governments. Something that is important to note as you think about our function is what we bring is really that impartial and independent review of public authorities and their conduct, and that's, as you think about this, one thing to always think about is, every system needs a pressure valve, and we can and we do provide that independent third-party review that often you need when someone is unhappy with the services you're providing. Our services are confidential to the complainant, and they're free, and so we try to make sure people understand that. And also we look to, we want to make sure that as we handle complaints where some complaints really are about one person, but others sometimes it's a policy or a procedure that's at play in an organization, and so we look to whether we can recommend to a public body about changes that can be made that can really benefit a number of people who are similarly situated to the complainant. So what is it we really look for? Well, we're all about administrative fairness. That's really our mandate. And so really the sorts of things we look for come from concepts embedded in administrative law, but they're really consistent and transparent decision making, and even-handed, that is to say impartial or neutral and reasonable application of rules, properly authorized policies and programs, and that those policies are supportive of the goals that you are trying to achieve. What does all that add up to? It really adds up to sort of fairness and respectful treatment of your citizens. So what happens when people come to us? So a complainant comes to us, we assess the complaint. Not every complainant that comes to us turns into a complaint that we investigate, far from it actually. The first thing we do is determine whether or not the complaint's in our jurisdiction. There's lots of cases where, for example, people come to us about the federal government or are concerned about a private business or whatever. Those are outside our jurisdiction. But assuming they say they're coming to us about the City of Surrey, that's a complaint that's in our jurisdiction. We look for a number of questions, but one of the first things we ask is, have you tried to resolve this problem with the city? Have you availed yourself of any internal review or appeal processes that the city has? And so we expect complainants to use those opportunities that exist. And we say to them, and if you're not happy, once you've done that, come back. Come back to us and we'll look at whether we should be investigating. So your first opportunity always will be to resolve the problem if you're able. And that's really, goes to the discussion that I had with the city manager earlier today, and really just saying that we appreciate very much the perspective and attitude that the city staff have to being willing to look again, to look at reviews where appropriate. Actually, I'll go back. We have an early resolution project program where things are urgent to resolve. But on the far right-hand side, you see we conduct investigations. That's really our stock and trade. And we do hundreds of them a year, as I said, for a whole wide variety of public bodies. And in that context, ultimately, we conduct an investigation, and then we'll come back to the public body and say, here's what we think. This is really sort of the profile of who those investigations or contacts are about. We get about 8,000 intakes a year. The big blue piece of the pie is for the provincial government. And you'll see the others described. Local governments are 7%, the red slice of the pie. And so that's all local governments in the province. And since you're one of the larger ones, you end up being a little bit near the top of the list, but good for you, you're not at the top. But you'll see the whole variety of things we investigate. And, for example, you look at health authorities. So we will be in your community talking to partners of the city in various things, Fraser Health, the school district, etc., because we get complaints about other entities that are here. So complaints about that 7%, that red slice of the pie, what are they about? About 4 out of 10 are about people who really didn't understand why a decision was made or didn't get adequate information from a municipality. So one strong thing that I'd be urging you to do is really look at how you communicate with citizens. For example, think about reasons and think about how do we, if we make a decision, what are meaningful reasons? Simply parroting a statute and saying, oh, the statute says not in the public interest, so we said it's not in the public interest, doesn't tell somebody why you came to a decision. What were the factors that you considered in deciding that something wasn't in the public interest? The next most significant area of complaint is bylaw enforcement. Then transparency of decision making, often questions of open and closed meetings, questions of public consultation, fees and fines and others. So you see those in descending order of volume. What do we look for from public bodies in terms of the kind of perspectives that they bring? Number one, a good internal dispute resolution process. Secondly, timely responses. Are you getting back to people in a timely way? An appropriate point of contact, that is to say somebody who can deal with the problem, not just somebody who says, well, I can't deal with it, but I'll find out an answer, and then comes back and relays the answer but can't answer questions. A culture of openness to reevaluation. I think that every big public administration organization is going to be making lots of decisions. Not all of those decisions are going to be right. And so creating that culture to openness to reviewing a situation is really important. And then lastly, sort of keeping your administrative closets clean. Regularly reviewing the policies and procedures inside the organization to make sure that they reflect your current culture and your current organizational goals. We've had a couple of significant reports over the past couple of years related to local government. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Open Meetings Best Practices Guide that we released a couple of years ago. Then in 2014, we looked at the riparian areas regulation, which can touch on municipal land use planning related to water. And we're coming out in the next month with a best practices guide with respect to bylaw enforcement, best practices guide for bylaw enforcement in local government. So that'll be out hopefully next month. Just a few words about the Open Meetings Guide. This was a recurring issue that we were getting complaints about, and it's obviously an important issue for transparency and accountability. And so we tried to look at what are the common challenges facing local government and what were effective ways to address those. And really, this is what those best practices, the kind of concepts that they fall under. Number one, providing public notice in advance, closing the meeting, and the considerations that go into closing the meeting, using the provisions of the community charter to determine whether it's necessary, providing as much detail as possible about the basis for closing the meeting. What happens in the meeting, in the closed meeting, that is to say restricting it only to the issue that you went into the closed meeting about, and taking minutes. So not just because it's a closed meeting doesn't mean that there aren't minutes taken and the recording of people who were there. And then a continuous review for when you can release information with respect to what went on, because often the need to close the meeting is time limited. Once that time expires, adopting a practice of releasing information thereafter. That report has been quite well received by local governments across the province. They really felt it was helpful in trying to decide and trying to administer the question of closed meetings, which is problematic and difficult for local governments. As I said, our best practices guide on bylaw enforcement is coming out next month, and really it's kind of a beginning to end set of best practices. We're just in the process of finalizing it, but really it goes right from your role as a council in terms of drafting the bylaws and being conscious of drafting bylaws that are actually enforceable, through to appeals, through enforcement and on to appeals at the end of the day. We're looking at including a number of checklists that are hopefully practical for you, but it can be a tool. These best practices guide can be a tool for you to ask city staff, how do we measure up in Surrey as against what would be considered best practices in either open meetings or in bylaw enforcement. So with that, I think that's really all I have to say. I'm conscious of your time and happy to entertain any questions that you have.
Thank you so much. It's good to hear that we have staff that are open to reevaluation, and that really speaks to our outstanding senior management team. So any questions? I see questions from Mayor Hepner.
Thank you, Councillor. And thank you for your presentation. Surrey's had a long history with the Ombudsman and respecting the work that the Ombudsman's office does. In fact, in a former life, in 1995, was appointed the city's liaison to the Provincial Ombudsman's office, and I can tell you that what you learn in that role is all about analyzing policy and its fairness and where it needs some tweaking or does not. So the Ombudsman's Ombudsman's Office has served a long history of being able to show, but my personal experience has been that many of the complaints that came in relative to the city over the decade that I was analyzing our policies and regulations are that simply it's a matter of communication, and in many times those complaints have not been effectively managed early on in the process. So I'm not sure if that's what you were saying in terms of customer assessment and client assessment when they first come in, but actually making sure that they understand sometimes the complexities behind those decisions is really at the forefront, and I'm proud to see that you're making those pamphlets and books available that actually help smaller communities and places that probably don't have the same level of sophistication in terms of their senior staff as Surrey does. So thanks for your presentation here today.
Great. So any other questions? Thank you so much for your presentation, and I'm going to call for adjournment. Motion to adjourn. Thank you.